Hi, I'm Rhea Wilson, and welcome to another episode of Mapping the Divine, a new project that seeks to study religious experience, history, and philosophy through multiple faith traditions. Today's guest is Professor John Proios, a current professor of ancient Greek philosophy, whose recent research is on ancient Greek epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of science. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Rhea. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, I would love to get right into asking a few questions, but to begin, I think we should establish a few terms so that we are on the same page as the audience. Today, we're going to focus on Buddhist and Socratic, or rather Platonistic, ideologies, their similarities and effects on religion, their socio-historical roles, and how they differ from contemporary understandings of reality. For example, for Buddhists, they were non material atomists, meaning that they believe reality, both material and non material, breaks down to atoms. Or the ancient Greeks, Plato's theory of form speaks to two realms which exist, a physical world where we experience, and a higher realm which is perfect. Can you speak a little more to this and their similarities and differences?
Yeah, definitely. So it's an interesting comparison to draw in the first place. I think it's not an intuitive one, but you're right that there are definitely some connections. Um, so I'll start with Buddhism. And one thing that I want to say, so it's not just that the Buddhists were non-materialist atomists, but that they are, right?
Yeah.
Buddhism is a sort of a living tradition, and there's many different views within the tradition, and it's not like there's a kind of hegemonic, homogenous, here's the doctrine kind of thing. Um, However, there are definitely sets of related ideas that you can get when you look at ancient texts, and in my very limited exposure to contemporary religious Buddhist practice, I have encountered people who are practicing Buddhists who say things that sound very familiar to me, having read some of these more ancient texts. So anyway, so that's just like a preface. But um, what I would say, what I teach in my class where we talk about Buddhist metaphysics is that right? But uh, Buddhists are non-materialist atomists, which means that they think that reality breaks down into really basic, indivisible stuff. That's what it is for something to be an atom. It's supposed to be indivisible. So it's a kind of basic unit of reality. But unlike many other types of atomists, for instance, the Greek atomists, they were not materialists. So they don't think that the atoms are necessarily physical substances. Some of them are. The Rupa Dharmas are. So that's like earth, air, water, fire. But then there are other kinds of uh, bits of reality that aren't material. And so this is where I think the Buddhist view is just really unique and um, unlike the Platonist view. Buddhists, at least in the sort of the stuff that I teach, the view that you get is that um, reality is a kind of constantly unfolding event, and that event is made up itself of a bunch of mini constantly unfolding events. And what the quote unquote atoms are in the Buddhist scripture, it'll be called the dharmas. The dharmas are these uh, uh, aspects of events broken down into their most minuscule features. So there's some sound happening as I speak. There's some consciousness happening as I think, right? There's also some brown happening on this table in front of me, right? And Buddhists try to explain how the reality that we experience is actually a kind of conjunction of these different, constantly changing, coming to be and ceasing events, how they interact with each other. And there's a lot more to say about that. Right, but that's the sense in which they're non-materialist atomists. That the way I teach it in class is that they're event atomists. They think that reality breaks down into these tiny events, and that these events are constantly changing. So that this is the I think one really big important difference between a Buddhist metaphysics and a Platonist metaphysics. So for Plato, he agrees with a sort of Buddhist idea that uh, reality as we experience it is not what reality really is. In fact, there are these more basic substances that account for and explain reality as we experience it. These are what are traditionally called the forms. Um, but for Plato, what's sort of important about the forms and why they explain the reality as we experience it is that they're unchanging, they're eternal and utterly permanent, right? Whereas for a Buddhist, that's just not the case. And one thing I also wanted to note was that in a tradition that in the class that you took with me, Ria, we didn't read a later Buddhist tradition. Mahayana Buddhism developed through this very influential Buddhist named Nagarjuna. It's a first century Indian thinker, and yeah, had a really big influence on the tradition. In part because what Nagarjuna argued is that this idea that there are these really, really basic event atoms that are kind of like come into existence and then go out of existence. He argued that actually that too is an illusion. And even the so-called dharmas are actually unreal. And so you can see how sort of like the trend is towards breaking down and deconstructing reality. And for someone like Nagarjuna, ultimately finding that like there actually is nothing left over once you've done your deconstruction. Whereas for Plato, it's exactly the opposite. Yes, there is this deconstruction of reality, but the thing that you find is uh, this fundamental structure that underlies everything, and that is eternal and never goes away. And the last thing I wanted to say about this is that there is a view out there among some scholars that Plato's idea of forms, and this is why I think your question was really interesting. Plato's idea of forms is sort of itself in the Greek atomist tradition, insofar as the atomists were responding to this challenge from this Greek thinker Parmenides to explain how change is possible and explain why everything isn't a simple, unchanging unity, as Parmenides had sort of challenged. And the atomists had one answer, and some people think that Plato's forms are a kind of non-materialist version of atomism in that Greek sense, right? So if you want, in a sense, you could think that that Buddhists and Platonists are actually both non-materialist atomists, right? But then they differ really fundamentally on what they think those atoms are, what their natures are, specifically in this issue of how long do they stick around for, what is their sort of degree of reality. Yeah, I think that's probably enough to answer your question.
Yeah, for sure. That's really interesting. Can you speak a little bit more about like how this, if you can, inform their moral code, or how like more, especially talking about like ancient Buddhism, how did it impact the way that these societies viewed right and wrong? And you can go like west and east for this question.
Yeah, yeah. So what's the relationship between morality and the the sort of metaphysical and epistemological views? Well, I mean, I think partly this is a question that goes outside the scope of my area of
Yeah.
knowledge. In particular, I mean, I'm not a historian of religion, and especially not of Eastern and South Asian religion. I mean, I sort of engage with Buddhism to the extent that as a philosopher who was trained in very much in the sort of Western analytic tradition, um, I go as far as I can. So I have no sort of like real expertise to drop here on this question. But I mean, I can say a few things about how, to me, it seems the sort of ancient Buddhist and Platonist conceptions of reality were related to their thinking about morality and how we should live together and that kind of thing. Um, so I think one thing to say about Buddhism is that certainly what I find in the texts that I read and teach is an emphasis on certain kinds of moral dispositions, uh, uh, cultivating certain kinds of dispositions that are usually supposed to be responsive in some way to the theory of reality. So you shouldn't be attached to things, right? Because everything is ultimately fundamentally impermanent, right? So you shouldn't be attached to things. So that means that you're going to need to figure out how to develop dispositions that allow you to not be attached to things. So I think here, thinking about something like the virtue of charity or generosity is something that sort of very naturally pairs with a Buddhist conception of reality. Um, Certainly, ideas about non-harm or like pacifism, I think, very much pair with a Buddhist conception of reality. Um, and there are later texts texts that talk more explicitly about this. There's a kind of a famous argument from a much, much, much later text that might not even be original to this text. It might be something that someone inserted within the last 500 years. But basically, it argues that because people are not fundamentally different from each other, so this is something that I didn't touch on before, but this Buddhist idea of non-self, so there is no core to you as an individual, that's just kind of an illusion. So this text argues that because of that, um, there is no rational ground for partiality in our dealings with each other. So I have no reason to privilege my suffering over yours or my mother's suffering over a stranger's, right? Everybody's suffering is equivalently bad. And as a Buddhist committed to the alleviation of all suffering, that's a kind of fundamental tenet. I ought to be committed to the alleviation of everybody's suffering indifferently, and that includes animals as well as includes non-human animals as well as human animals. Um, so that's one. So that's maybe one thing to say about Buddhism. I think with Plato, I mean, I'm more of an expert here, but at the same time, there's in a way there's less to say in terms of the social influence question, just because Plato had so little influence on the society that he lived in. I think there you can see the traces of his influence centuries later, and certainly his ideas were picked up by later Christians via the so-called Neoplatonists, who were not exactly followers of Plato, but people who developed a kind of philosophical school in competition with the Stoics, Epicureans, and Aristotelians, and claimed Plato as their kind of uh, point of origin, and certainly are constantly in dialogue with him. And Christians, there's a lot of overlap between Neoplatonic and early Christian ideas. Um, so you can see that connection. And I think one thing that is really sort of important for Plato, thinking about the relationship between conception of reality and morality, is that Plato too is very interested in ideas of detachment and not being overly controlled by the objects of your desire. So this emphasis on self-control and self-regulation. He has this very famous passage in the Republic where he talks about how a good man ought to grieve, right? So ideas about like grief being kind of fundamentally an inappropriate emotion to feel because um, the only thing that ought to matter from your moral standpoint is how you order your soul. So, if the soul is the fundamental core of the person, as it is for Plato, then really its character is the only thing that matters from a moral perspective. And loss of things outside of yourself is not something that can directly affect the order of your soul. Of course, you can frustrate, or I shouldn't say not frustrate, but you can mess up the order of your soul by getting upset about the loss of things outside of you. And so, in that sense, it's very similar to Buddhism. Um, right. So, and I think that you can sort of see some of these ideas in later early Christian uh, texts, and I think through the Neoplatonists, I do think there is probably some communication there. But as I said, in Plato's own time and place, it was not very influential. The only way that you could see some kind of influence is um, through the people that he influenced, who then went on to uh, have more influence on the society. So I'm thinking of the Stoics, for instance, who were actually pretty widely read and engaged with, at least by Greek and especially Roman elites. And the Stoics claimed Plato's Socrates as the founder of their school, although there is no actual direct historical connection there. But there is a lineage. There is actually a direct lineage from the Socratic circle of which Plato was a member and the origins of the Stoic school. So, and there's a lot of overlap there in terms of ideas of self-control.
Okay, yeah. So I guess it's kind of hard to pinpoint like an exact answer for the following question, but do you have anything to speak about in terms of the spirituality of these societies and how that intersects with their conceptualized reality? Of course, like there's probably more um, familiarity with Greece, but also, I guess, in terms of Eastern Buddhism, karma, and all that stuff. I guess, how does that intersect with spirituality?
Hmm. Can you tell me more what you mean by spirituality?
I guess the beliefs of those around them, like the society, rather than just like um, these few individuals. Mentioned like in Plato's time, like he wasn't as influential. But how does his own writings like intersect with the popular spiritual beliefs of his time?
Hmm. Okay, I see. Yeah. So I mean, I think from my perspective, um, Platonic texts and early Buddhist texts both are trying to intervene into a cultural landscape that predates them. And so they have certain things incumbent on them to show. So for a Buddhist, one really important, you might say, form of spirituality is this idea of karma, where that means, roughly that the actions you take in this life will uh, uh, have consequences in your next life. And with that is the idea of reincarnation as well. And I think Buddhists don't want to, Buddhism is a very heterodox school in lots of ways. It's opposing lots of things that we take for granted, and certainly lots of things that in its own time and place were taken for granted, or if not taken for granted, were parts of the sort of more official religious schooling. But this is one thing where Buddhists don't want to challenge the sort of really fundamental idea, at least early Buddhists don't want to challenge the really fundamental idea that there is karma, that there is reincarnation. But so instead, they have to come up with new ways of conceptualizing it in a way that is consistent with their metaphysical and epistemological views. In particular, if there is no self, how can there be karma? And that to me is sort of just one of the really basic challenges that many, many Buddhists have had to deal with as a sort of intellectual problem. Um, I feel like, the sort of form of spirituality that is being preserved there is not necessarily all that different. The idea is that your actions have consequences, and so you should care about your actions, right? Buddhists tend to conceptualize that as uh, your actions have psychological consequences in a kind of very ordinary and intuitive sense. That if I habitually do things that a greedy person would do, then I cultivate greed in myself, right? Um, I think one thing that I was thinking in relation to your question initially was that something that sticks out to me as really important to Buddhist spirituality are the practices and rituals. And two that stick out to me are the idea of meditation. So, really serious, consistent, and um, structured forms of meditation are very important to contemporary Buddhist practice and were important thousands of years ago as well. And the basic idea with meditation is that you are practicing, um, you are sort of, in a way, you're sort of practicing or enacting the Buddhist metaphysical worldview, which is that there is no fundamental core to you. It's all these kind of discrete events happening and interacting with each other. And what you're supposed to do as a meditator is you're supposed to get into a position where you no longer experience yourself as a unified subject, but begin to see these discrete events happening and be able to look at them and let them go rather than cling and hold on to them as if they were a part of you, right? So that to me is like one of those really important and I think striking features of what I think of as Buddhist spirituality. Um, and I will say again, I think that this question may also take different shape depending on where in the world we're talking about. I mean, Buddhism as a religion spread pretty far. Just thinking in Asia, I mean, its roots are in South Asia and India, Tibet, Vietnam. But it also spread to East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, right? And I think it takes different forms in different places depending on how it interacts with the culture. Um, when it comes to Plato, I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a different question. I hinted at some of it earlier with the connection with Christianity, but I will say just on this question of sort of like what does Plato have to preserve? I mean, I think Plato is also like the Buddhists, very happy to say, well, our culture is just fundamentally wrong. These things that we take for granted are actually just not true. But that's he still finds actually ways. So, one thing is like the gods, the traditional sort of Greek pantheon of gods. Um, he is critical of ways that the gods are represented. He thinks that the things that are said about them couldn't, in fact, be true about them. But it's not like he ever says something to the effect of they don't exist. In fact, he seems to argue against that. He does have some very monotheistic tendencies, which I think we'll come back to. Um, but he also tends to find ways for identifying uh, gods and giving them sort of place within his philosophical system. So, in the myth, in the Phaedrus, Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, um, uh, the soul is said to. So Plato has a lot of ideas that sort of maybe have some kind of Eastern origin. It's unclear to me, but reincarnation is one of them. Or maybe through by Egypt he got these ideas. It's not so clear, but the soul, the soul and the body are these distinct things. The soul is supposed to have had a life before it was in a body, and one of the things that, according to the Phaedrus, it does is the soul flies up into the outermost regions of space, and it circumnavigates the entire cosmos. And while it's doing that, it follows in the train of a certain god, and which god it follows in the train of is a reflection of its character. So philosophical souls are supposed to follow in the train of Zeus. I forget exactly the others. I should have looked it up. I'm sorry, but someone else is going to follow in the train of Ares. Someone else is going to follow in the train of Hera, right? And it's going to reflect on their soul. And so you can see, Aphrodite. So you can see how there are ways that he kind of takes these gods and some almost like makes them archetypes for certain ways of human life, and then fits that into a philosophical system where these ideas about reincarnation and the afterlife and similar sort of familiar religious ideas, where he's kind of reworking all of that within very much an alternative to the Greek, you know, what was typically taught to Greek children.
Wow, that's really interesting. Um, you mentioned again like the intersection of Plato's teachings with then Christianity later on. How did the shift to monotheism mark a change in how that part of the world began to conceptualize reality? And how do you think I guess, relevance of Plato's work and his teachings shift during that time?
Yeah. Right. So I was saying, there is this historical connection. I mean, how much of a connection it really is I think disputed, but certainly there were many early Christian, uh, important early Christian figures who were in dialogue with the so-called Neoplatonists. And I think one thing that the Neoplatonists had, which they certainly got from Plato, is an emphasis on monotheism. So Plato and Aristotle too, they kind of find ways to accommodate polytheism in the way that I was just saying, but the overall trend is towards thinking that there is one main God, and that God is in some sense responsible for the existence and functioning and nature of the cosmos. Plato and Aristotle disagree with each other about this exactly. Aristotle's God has a lot less to do with the world than Plato's. Plato's God is very much a creator God, right? So in that sense, it's very similar to the sort of Abrahamic perspective. Um, uh, Yeah, and so I think that there's a lot of continuity there. However, I also think that there are differences. For instance, I think with Plato, there's more of an emphasis on, God is not quite all powerful for Plato. Plato's creator God is not quite all powerful. There are constraints under which he works. Um, he is very much interacting with the world. Whereas from my perspective, the sort of more Abrahamic view is this creation from nothing, where there are no constraints on God, and God sort of is radically separate from the world, even though he can, because he is all powerful, choose to intervene, right? I think for Plato, there's still more of a sense that God is, um, yes, separate from the world, but in a way still um, a part of it. There's still one big whole, and God, and the sort of main single God, even though that God's the most important divine figure, that God is still in a sense a part of the world. Now, there's questions there. I mean, how separate Plato's God is I think an issue, and certainly Aristotle's God is very much separate from the world and interacts with it in this very limited causal sense that is really for Aristotle a question of physics, actually. Um, so yeah, that's just to say I think that there's some continuity, but also some differences. Yeah, I can say more about that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, for sure. And kind of, do you think that there were any similar changes happening in the East as it pertains to Christianity and Judaism and the rise of monotheism affecting any of the teachings, any of the ideologies that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, I think I mean I again this is out of my wheelhouse, but my guess, my hunch would be that it's not so much through the influence of Christianity or Judaism, but rather through Islam that monotheism it becomes influential in outside of Europe, basically. So I would think that the spread of Islam into West Asia and the Indian subcontinent in particular would be a place that you would want to look for that kind of interaction. Um, I tend to think actually that the influence for the Christianity perspective, I tend to think that the influence kind of runs in the other direction. You know, at the sort of dawn of what we tend to think of as like the modern European period, the period of the beginning of sort of European colonialism. One thing that I have learned from reading the work of other scholars like um, Geraldine Hang, for instance, is that Europe was really the sort of small power in town, and Christianity was much less influential than either Islam or any of the many religions in Eastern and Southern Asia, which can include Islam. But uh, basically, it was the Christians who were going east and coming back and bringing ideas with them
Right.
that they had gotten when they were out east, and that actually Christian missionaries were not all that influential on kind of local traditions in the East. But I mean, that's just my perspective. I could totally be wrong about that. That would be my hunch anyway.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. So shifting a little bit more towards like a specific Buddhist idea, um, Professor, you teach a class called The Philosophy of Life and Death, which I had the recently had the privilege of taking. Wonderful class, by the way. One of the central concepts we study is that of nirvana. And it's a term that we've heard in popular culture a lot, but what does it precisely mean and how can it apply to an individual's life? Um, like in modern Buddhism and also like ancient Buddhism.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think I don't know exactly how it gets talked about in modern Buddhism. I think that the main idea, as I understand it from the ancient texts, is that nirvana means cessation or going out. And so the fundamental, uh, you know, the fundamental problem from a Buddhist perspective is that life keeps going.
Yeah.
And so suffering keeps going. And as I was saying, it's not like this sort of me and my individual suffering. This is like a collective problem. There is this issue of karma and karmic rebirth in particular. That means that, well, dying now doesn't mean that life is going to stop because there is karmic rebirth. And so the answer to this problem is supposed to be nirvana. And so nirvana just means the cessation or the going out of this life process. The analogy that we talked about in class is that of a candle being blown out. If rebirth is one candle lighting another candle, then nirvana is the blowing out of the candle altogether, right? Um, and so in that sense, it's very counterintuitive from, I think when people hear nirvana today, they think like it's like a paradise of bliss kind of thing. But actually it's not. It's not even a state. It's a complete non-existence. And that is supposed to be the at least from the early texts, that is supposed to be the goal of Buddhist practice, is to engage in uh, 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 meditation and other kinds of um, personal practices that allow you to make progress towards nirvana. And if you are really sort of a member of the Buddhist order, then what your goal is not to reach nirvana for yourself, but to postpone your own nirvana in order to help all living creatures reach nirvana collectively.
Okay, that definitely is um, very helpful for clarifying. But could you point to a similar concept that exists in the West, going back to kind of comparing the two, or is this idea pretty unique in its scope to Buddhism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong on this, but I mean, from my perspective, it's pretty unique. I think it's in particular because it's a distinction from a view that I think is actually common. It's a close cousin of a view that in the Buddhist texts is called annihilationism.
Right.
Right, annihilationism is the idea that like when you die, the lights go out. That's it, right? And so that's something that you find. I mean, it's very common in the West. It's common in Greek texts that talk about this kind of issue. The ancient Epicureans thought this, and even in India itself, there is a school of thought, the Charvaka or the Lakayata, which just means that it's the view of the common people. But it's an actual philosophical school of thought that we have texts from that uh, is materialist in its orientation and thinks very much like the ancient Greek Epicureans that when you die, that's it. You end as a person. And I think nirvana is really supposed to be a distinction from that, a different type of view. It's the cessation of you as a person, the kind of quieting down of your karmic energies to the point where they no longer are producing further causal consequences, right? Um, and it is also supposed to be different in that nirvana is not quite the same thing as non-existence.
Right.
The Buddha is supposed to teach a middle way between two extremes: the extreme of eternalism, which I think is like the Platonic view or the Abrahamic view in the eternal soul that goes on to have an afterlife. So that's eternalism, and the ancient Vedics are modern day Hinduism is descended from this religious school, and they were the dominant view in ancient India, the dominant religion in ancient India, and their view was very much sort of eternalism. And then you have the Lakayata, the view of the common people, which is this annihilationism, right? And the Buddha's view is instead this middle way, which says, well, look, you were never actually a person to begin with. It was always an illusion. And so what I'm going to teach you is how to undo the illusion. And that to me is what nirvana is. It's the sort of complete undoing of the illusion of life.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. I think from what I studied under your class, I think I would also agree in saying that the idea of nirvana is pretty unique to Buddhism. So kind of shifting now to the modern day, given the current technological revolution we're undergoing, especially as it becomes more difficult to detach oneself from material possessions, do you think that these concepts in, say, 100, 200 plus years will remain with us, or do you think that they'll evolve into something entirely new, and continue to kind of shift, yeah, over time?
Can I just ask real quick, which concepts like nirvana and that, or what concepts were you referring to?
Yeah, sure, Nirvana.
Nirvana, like the kind of ancient philosophical
Yeah,
concepts. Yeah. Um, I mean, I think that like one thing that is always striking to me is how much of these ancient concepts are still with us, actually.
right.
Like the eternalism, annihilationism. I mean, I think that's actually how most people think about human life and the possibility of an afterlife. Kind of fits roughly into those two categories. Um, most people who aren't Buddhists, anyway. Uh, so I tend to think that I'm a historian fundamentally, I think. So I tend to think that there's more continuity in people's ideas over time than they realize. That the people think that there are these radical shifts, but actually it's more like there's modifications, not fundamental breaks. Um, and so when there are changes, you can kind of track and see the evolution. It's not like the old concepts just become irrelevant. But in any case, I mean, I think that like lots of ways that, just thinking from like a Buddhist perspective, I mean, I think that there's lots of ways that our technologies encourage us to be attached to all kinds of to them, right? And so I think that these ideas are, if anything, more relevant because it's you know, I don't know. I mean, there's a whole school of thought that thinks that basically we are more and more increasingly determined by the technology that we use. And so attempts to kind of explore spirituality and self cultivation outside of being determined by technology is, I think, even more relevant. I, that would be my perspective.
Okay, yeah. So, Professor, as we and near the end of our interview, like to ask one more question. So, you've dedicated your career to studying these ideas in a hyper-rationalistic world in which philosophy, to some, may have seemed taken a backseat to science. And this kind of relates to the previous question, but what value do you believe in studying? What value do you believe exists in studying these concepts, or do you even agree with the premise of my question?
Yeah, I appreciate the ending to that. I mean, I think I'm sort of willing to grant the premise, but I do also want to acknowledge that one very natural thing I think to say to this sort of like science makes philosophy obsolete kind of idea is that this distinction is itself a historical, a relatively recent historical phenomenon that's become really sharp in the last like 150 to 200 years. But for most of recorded human history, the boundary between so-called science and philosophy was quite fuzzy and sometimes was just there was no boundary. So the scientific revolution in Europe, for instance, was basically just people doing philosophy, but they discovered the value of experimentation.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's sort of like Robert Boyle realized that air doesn't naturally move in any direction because he did experimentation. And then this whole Aristotelian way of thinking of the natural world in terms of having innate powers was now in question, right? And Francis Bacon, Galileo, I mean, these were people who were doing experiment in order to explore the traditional problems of Greek, Roman, uh, 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 Catholic philosophy, basically. Um, uh, Catholic, and then I just mean the sort of like as one of the traditions that absorbed the kind of Greek and Roman philosophical schools. There were many others too. Um, and if you look in the ancient world, the Hippocratics, these medical doctors, I mean, they were doing a lot of stuff that was engaging with things that would become part of the philosophical canon, the Greek philosophical canon. Early Greek science is just what you'd learn in a history of philosophy class. You'd just read
Yeah.
Empedocles, and right. I mean, So this distinction is itself a historical phenomenon, and I think it's worth asking why it emerged. And to that extent, I sort of don't want to cede this distinction between philosophy and science, but rather to see contemporary science as a very peculiar way of doing philosophy, right? Um, and so in that sense, science presupposes answers to fundamental philosophical issues, raises new ones as it proceeds. But okay, even granting that we live in a world where there is this perceived distinction, what is the value of doing philosophy and not just like going and becoming an experimental physicist or something? Why not do that instead? And I think for me, the answer, I mean, there's many different sort of practical answers about why does one end up in one trade over another. But one value that I see in philosophy that I think is shared, there is an overlap with science, but I think it's sort of the philosophical part of science, is that people do philosophy every day in their ordinary lives. You sort of can't live your life without making assumptions about what you are, what a human being is, what kinds of norms and obligations we have, what beauty is, who produces it, what knowledge is, what reality is, right? We do this all the time. We make assumptions about um, how these questions should be answered. So often we don't realize we're making these assumptions, but sometimes sort of life creates friction, and we realize, oh, what do I think about this issue? Or I realize that I'm unclear about something, or that maybe I don't agree with what I realize I've been assuming all along, right? Um, uh, you know, what I mean, is a human being fundamentally a rational creature that's driven by reason, or is a human being fundamentally a passionate creature that's driven by its desires and emotions that are sort of not really responsive to reason? I mean, this is something that like Enlightenment thinkers asked, and you could question this distinction between reason and passion, but it's just one example of sort of like the kinds of things that seem very relevant to ordinary life, um, and that people kind of realize they are presupposing in their practical daily lives. And I think that it's worthwhile to try to train myself and try to train others in how to deal with these issues better. And that's basically what the value of philosophy is for me. And I think it's extremely valuable in a world where it feels like you don't need to do those things or answer those questions. You just, you know, sort of get slotted into a technological paradigm and without ever questioning that paradigm. But I think that's kind of like sort of the whole. I mean, to me, another way to put this is like to me, philosophy is about the sort of question of human agency and humans determining their own historical trajectory, right? We should have some control over what we do and where we go as a species, and not just sort of be driven by the forces that have the forces of history and who holds power in society and those kinds of things. And so, yeah, to me, that's what's valuable about philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. That was really well put. And thank you for this incredibly enlightening conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks for having me, Ria. I'm happy to do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much.